know me, I'm Nathalie. I'm sure you might have been able to spot from my accent already, but just in case, if you cannot quite place my accent yet, and if you're like, oh, I bet that girl is from Manchester. Well, no, I'm French. I've moved here 15 years ago now, and I never left. Right, let's go. So I started here because we are here by a statue of an amazing, daring woman of history. This is Emmeline Pankhurst. She's become an icon. She was the leader of the Suffragettes. So we'll talk about her today, but not only about her. We'll talk about quite a few interesting suffragettes. There are many more that deserve recognition. And just to show you how much research I've done for this tour, let me show you. Google is now targeting me with interesting ads. I'll post a photo in the chat. So, because I've looked them up so much, Google is now convinced that I really want some socks with Emmeline Pankhurst. I mean, she's amazing, but I don't really need the socks. Thank you, Google. So just to prove that I've done my homework. Anyway, let's go. So Emmeline, she was a famous suffragette. But before to tell you about the suffragettes, I need to tell you about the suffragists. Slightly different movement. The suffragists, they had been fighting for women vote for half a century before the suffragettes. And before to even tell you about the suffragists, I have to tell you about the reason why those ladies wanted the vote. Because, why did they need to vote anyway? I don't have the right to vote because I don't have a British passport. So I could get one if I wanted to pay 1,700 quid, but I don't. And I live perfectly fine. I can vote in the local elections, I can vote for the mayor, but I don't vote for the general elections. And I live absolutely fine with that. Why is that? It's because I'm not, in my daily life, I'm not confronted to unfairness, or maybe minor, but not as bad as it would have been for those ladies in Victorian times. Victorian society, the dynamic between men and women was just horrible and extremely, extremely unfair. Just to give you a few examples, until the 1880s, you had any police officer on the street, if they suspected you of being a loose woman, a prostitute, because of the contagious diseases, before the Contagious Disease Act I think it's 1882, the officers were allowed to arrest you, even if they just suspected that you might be a sex worker, and they'll put you through a very intimate examination. How fair is that? The men never had any of that for absolutely no reason, Stéphane. Yeah, there's actually a lady, a suffragist lady that she was a lady from high society, but she dressed up in rags and she tried, and she was indeed arrested. Of course, when the police realized that she was a lady from high society, they were ever so sorry. But yeah, those stuff would happen. On top of that, you had when you married, well, before to be married, you were pretty much your property was your father's. When a lady married, all their property went to the husband. To give you an idea, we have a lady, we'll see her statue at the end of the tour. Her name was Millicent Garrett Fawcett, an amazing suffragist. She was once robbed in Waterloo Station. They took her wallet with I don't know how much money, let's say £5. When she was, I don't know why my signal is dropping. Hopefully it'll get better. When she made the police report, it said that they had stolen from her person, and they said they had stolen £5, the property of Henry Fawcett. What? Her husband Henry he was not even in London. How can they have stolen from him, because everything that belonged to her was, according to the law at the time, it was Henry's property. So very, very unfair. I'm not sure why is it really blurred? We're going to turn here anyway. If it doesn't get better in a minute, I can change SIM card, but not sure what's happening. So yeah, it's fine. Okay. So the Property Act only changed that in the 1880s. We also had well, you know, a lot of the problems that I might have mentioned in some of my tours, like the, you know, the baby farmers, for example. You know, we might have spoken about those ladies that had to give their babies away, and some of those baby farmers that were literally killing the little ones to make money. This is because the trade was terribly regulated. If there had been women in parliament, this type of problems would have been solved way earlier. You know, and this is just to name a few of the unfairness of society at the time. And Emmeline Pankhurst, she came from a family of activists, really. Even her parents were fighting against slavery and for women's rights. Her husband, Dr. Pankhurst, was also a suffragist. And she lost her husband quite early on. A lot of the... you know what, guys? Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to swap SIM card. So it's just going to take a minute. You may have to refresh because I usually have good signal here. I don't understand why it's not great today. So I'm just going to move to 3 Mobile. Bear with me. It should be just a minute. Okay, it should be much better. Are we all good? Are we all back? Hopefully it should be much clearer. I don't know what's happening these days. I've got one of my SIM cards that's always perfect. Anyway, we are now in front of St. John's Church. Would you believe the suffragettes? They had actually tried to bomb that church. We'll get to the bombings in a little while, because the suffragette, as opposed to the suffragist, they were basically terrorists. You know, they were using very violent technique like bombs and arsons. So they had tried to bomb this church. Today it's a concert hall. It's no longer a church. And ironically, this is where they not celebrating. They had the funerals of Emmeline Pankhurst. So to come back to Emmeline, she was, she was an upper class lady and all that, but she lost her husband quite early on. And, you know, at the time when you lost your husband, that's it. You know, you didn't have any income. There was not much like pensions for ladies and stuff like that. So she had to downsize her property and she had to take a job. She took a job for the Poor Law Guardians. Now, the Poor Law Guardians, I'm going to have to explain that one, because to explain it, basically, it all started because of Henry VIII. He's made an absolute mess when he broke up with the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn, his mistress. He confiscated all the land that belonged to the abbeys and the monasteries, and he gifted them to noble families. And the problem is all those monasteries, they used to take care of the poor. It was the church that dealt with the very poor. And suddenly there was no one to take care of the poor anymore, because those monasteries, those abbeys, they didn't have any space anymore. They were confiscated. So they had to create those public boards to take care of the poor. So that's what Emmeline, a couple of centuries later, was doing. She was working. So that's what it looks like in inside now. She was working for the Poor Law Guardian Board. We have spoken about the Poor Law Guardian Board in my tours before, when we talked about Polly Nichols, the first Ripper victim. When she was going through a divorce with her husband and she found herself on the street, it is people like Emmeline Pankhurst that would have assisted her and help her get some kind of money from her husband. So when Emmeline was in that position, she dealt with the people at the workhouses. The workhouses, they were those accommodation for the very, very poor, the Victorian poor. It was not a place where you wanted to be. And Emmeline witnessed that in her own term, I've read her memoir, she witnessed that in the workhouses for the men and the women were divided into different wings because they did not want them to have fun. The men, some of them, to be fair, the Victorians, they like to divide the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. A lot of the men were maybe a little bit more lazy and addicted to alcohol. And ladies, there were some very respectable ladies in the workhouses. But at the time, you lost your husband, that was it, you didn't have any support anymore, and you could very, very quickly end up on the streets. Emmeline had witnessed it herself when she lost her husband. Most of the famous suffragettes, they have lost their husband early, or they've lost their dad early, and then their mum were struggling to feed the kids. So Victorian society was really unfair. So that's why those ladies really wanted to act, and they wanted to be represented in Parliament. And that's why today, we often take this right for granted. And even though I don't have it, I live absolutely fine with that. I can vote in the local election. Some ladies could already vote in the local elections at the time, but they wanted to be represented in Parliament, and that's only fair. So the movement really started pacifically with the suffragists, but over 50 years, they had no evolution, no development whatsoever. About 16,000 petitions had been given to Parliament. Nothing had changed. They had been marching and all that with Millicent Garrett Fawcett. She remained a pacifist. And eventually, Emmeline Pankhurst, she had a bit of a revelation at the beginning of the 1900s. Can I vote in France? Yes, Mark. But to be honest, I only vote because I care about the reputation of my country. Because really, it doesn't make I don't pay taxes in France, I've been paying taxes here for 15 years, So if anything, I'd prefer to vote here. But yeah. Anyway, so the Pankhurst family, Emmeline had a daughter, all the family, they were all activists, but Christabel, she went with a friend of her, Annie Kelly. She went to disturb a meeting with Churchill. He was a young politician at the time in Manchester. They went to heckle the meeting, and they came out of the audience with a banner, and they were like, "Vote for women. When are they gonna get the vote?" And they were kicked out of the room, but that was not enough to get arrested. Christabel wanted to get arrested. She had told her mum, "I'll get arrested today." So when a police officer grabbed her, she spat on him. Then she got arrested. They offered her to pay a bail to not go to prison. She refused. She wanted to be in prison. Even Churchill offered to pay the bail to avoid the scandal, but no. Christabel went to prison, and that was a big deal in the press. So that's how Emmeline was like, "Oh, this is what we should do. Deeds, not words. To get publicity in the press, we need to create scandal." So that's when they created the WSPU, so the Women's Social Political Union. And they started to become militant. They wanted to cause trouble, anything that would end up in the press, because they had been pushed into a corner by Parliament. They had tried for years and years to get some decision made, and nothing happened. So that was in 1903, and they started they started soft. They started to, what they used to do at the beginning, the suffragettes. They were named the suffragettes in 1906 by the Daily Mail. It started as an insult, really, in the newspaper. But Emmeline embraced it, and she pronounced it suffragette, because they wanted to get the vote. So she really embraced the title, and it became the movement of the suffragettes. The suffragists were still around. You still had a lot of ladies that wanted the vote, but they were still pacifist. At the beginning of the movement, they were not that violent. Most of the time, those ladies would hide. They'll follow the politicians. So when the boys were, for example, Churchill would go and play golf, they'll hide in the bushes for hours and hours, and then they'll jump out and they'll be like, when are we going to get the vote? Vote for women. They had all those banners and those sash and those pins and brushes, and they started to chain themselves to railings as well. That was actually very successful because they got the idea, they got inspired by what they used to do in the asylum, the mental health institutions. But when you chained yourself to a railing, you'd get an audience because people would look, they'll all gather and look at what's happening. And the police officers, they would often take up to an hour to be able to break the lock or sew it off. So for an hour, the suffragettes had an audience. So they could make a speech. They could talk about all those unfairness, and they could speak about all what was wrong in society. Those suffragettes, they came from every background, although it was easier for middle-class women, because a lot of the working-class women, they just couldn't get a day out of work. And they couldn't really wear a pin or sash or anything like that, because if they wore a badge at work, they could be sacked. And some have been sacked. The movie, you might have heard of the movie Suffragettes that came out maybe 10 years ago. It's a very good movie to see how those ladies would lose their jobs, sometimes lose their husband. And of course, there were a lot of people that were completely against the suffragettes. And some of those people were ladies. Some ladies, and some very smart ladies, were completely against women's vote. I know it seems really hard to imagine, but we had, for example, Mrs. Humphrey Ward. Her real name was Mary Augusta Ward. She wanted to be called Mrs. Humphrey. She wanted to be called after her husband. She was completely against. And we started to have a lot of posters. Let me show you a few examples of posters and cards, anti-suffrage cards. Let me post a few. So those would be, they'll make fun of not only the suffragettes, but their husbands. They'll make fun of the movement. I'll just post a few more because I think they're fascinating. Those, and that was the opinion at the time for most people. Often they were associated with lesbianism. So they said, oh, soon all ladies will be lesbians and then there won't be any babies and then the British race would die. Ridiculous arguments. Some of the arguments were that the ladies were just not smart enough. Their brains were smaller. They were almost treated like kids, The streets were not even made for ladies. There was no public toilets for ladies or anything like that. Ladies, respectable ladies, were meant to stay at home. So it was, it was a different period, really. And so those suffragettes, they did soft, for many years. And of course, many of them were arrested and then they were taken to prison because they did not want to pay the bail. They wanted to go to prison. And then they did the hunger strikes. That was very embarrassing for government because they did not want a martyr. They did not want any of them to die in prison. So they had to start force feeding. That was a horrible process. There would be maybe like 6 of them grabbing a lady, forcing her to sit on a chair, and then insert a tube into their nose, not into their mouth, because they could, of course, close their mouth, but through their nose and all the way down to their stomach. and then they would inject into their stomach some. Most of the time, it was eggs, like raw eggs on milk, very caloric, but that was very painful. And some of them suffered from indigestions and heart disease the rest of their life. Emmeline's sister, actually, she died 2 days after being released. When the ladies were dying, they would release them because they did not want bad publicity. The government did not want those ladies to die in prison. So horrible force feeding. And some ladies went through that process twice a day, Emily Davidson, we'll talk about her in a little while. She was force fed 49 times. And very terrible process. And eventually, there was a bill in 1910 that was going to potentially allow women to vote. You'd have to bear in mind that at the time, not all men could vote. Only about 60% of men could vote because you had to own property. So, and actually, until 1832, technically, it did not state men could vote. Any property owner, but under Lord Earl Grey, in 32, they actually named it men. Some ladies actually tried to vote because they were landowner, so they went. Technically, they were on the register. So some ladies went. They tried. One was Maxwell Lilly, I think, in Manchester, and another one Lydia Ernestine. They tried to go to vote. Of course, they were kicked out. But technically, because they were landowners, they were on the register. So anyway, there was one bill at Parliament that was maybe going to go down. So the suffragettes agreed to stop. They stopped all the militancy for 10 months. And then suddenly that bill was ignored. It was rejected. And 300 suffragettes walked on to Parliament Square. This is an event known as Black Friday. That was a Friday in November 1910. And that was a disaster. There was a ridiculous amount of police brutality. They had called some police officers down from the East End. The police officers in the East End, they were used to deal with, drunken, fighting ladies, and, they were rough. And to give you an example, there was a suffragette, Sophia Dilip Singh. I'll tell you a bit more about her in a moment. She was walking down with another suffragette that was in a wheelchair. You can imagine an Edwardian wheelchair. It was actually a tricycle. One police officer grabbed the disabled lady. He dropped her on the floor. He blocked the tire of the wheelchair so she would be stranded even if she managed to go back on her chair. And then he incited the local men to slash the tires. This is the type of brutality we're talking about. I know Sophia was a princess. She attacked a police officer. I hope it was him. And a lot of those ladies were they grabbed their boobs and everything because they were like, they wanted to show them a lesson. So there were a lot of sexual abuse as well that day. So it was a bit of a disaster for both camps. It was a bit of a shame for government as well because there were a lot of police brutality. And after that event of Black Friday, Pankhurst, she decided that it was too dangerous for the suffragettes. So she decided to go underground, to start a war, a proper war, but guerrilla warfare, not demonstrating on the streets, but putting bomb, arsons, exploding mailboxes. So that's when they became what we would call today terrorists. The history of the suffragette has been kind of sanitized. If you want to get an idea of the scale of the terrorism, there's a book that made a lot of noise when it came out about 4 years ago. There's a young historian, her name is Fern Rydell, I think. She came across a manuscript from one of the suffragettes. Her name was Kitty Marion. Kitty Marion she was originally from Germany, and she worked in the music halls as a singer. And in the music halls, every show promoters, to give her a job, they wanted to sleep with her. And of course, Kitty Marion found that unacceptable. So she was a bit like the first Me Too. And she was so frustrated with the that all those men that believed it was absolutely fine to request a kiss or more to get her a job. And she became the most dangerous of the suffragettes. She was described as the most dangerous of Edwardian ladies. And very recently, her manuscript, she had actually written a biography that was never published. They found it in a few years ago, and there's a book that came out called Death in 10 Minutes. Kitty Marion's life. And it's really interesting because you realize the scale. One of the bombs she planted in a post office in Southeast London, there was enough there to kill the 100 people in the building, really. They have been lucky that they've not killed anyone, but the minute you start putting bombs in public places, you cannot guarantee that no one would be killed. And thank you, Tish. Yeah, that's the one. So they, honestly, in today's definition, they became terrorists. Now, the impact that the suffragettes had on the vote, it is actually debatable. Some said that they might have delayed it more than anything else, because the suffragists were still acting at the same time, being pacifist, and they tried to terrorize the public, and it worked. But to give you an idea, May 1912, 52 bombs on arsons were stopped in the UK. And they used to bomb politicians' homes as well. Of course, they would hope that the politician was not home, but you can never guarantee that they're not home, And they used to set their homes on fire as well. And in 1913, they started to use guns as well. So I know when you think of the suffragettes, usually you think of that. Let me show you in the chat a little GIF. We think about Mary Poppins and Mrs. Banks. Well, after 1910, it was much more violent than that. Anyway, let's go and see their memorial. That's completely unrelated. That's a memorial for a composer. Let me show you his name. We are now in a former graveyard. So that's, it's not focusing. So that's Henry Purcell. So this little square here used to be a graveyard. I'll tell you a bit more about the people that are buried here as we come back. But let's go and take a look at the memorial. The memorial here was unveiled in 1970. And there were a few suffragettes that were still alive. One of them, she's amazing. Her name is Leonora Cohen. She was a militant all her life until the 1970s when they were fighting for equal pay bill, and she was here when they unveiled the monument. Leonora, she had so she came down to London to listen to a speech from Parkhurst. And Emmeline was inciting to violence, really, and to do something that would shock the public, that would end up in the press. So Leonora, she was from Leeds. She grew up in a family where she lost her dad very, very young as well. So again, her mum absolutely struggled to feed them. And when she came down to London, she wanted to act. She wanted to do something. She wanted to end up in the newspaper. But she didn't know quite yet what to do. So she bought a London guidebook. And she flipped the pages. She wanted to attack the establishment. And she saw the Tower of London, the crown jewels. So she went and bought a crowbar. She hid it under her jacket. She jumped on the underground to go to Tower Hill. Arriving at Tower Hill Station, she hesitated. She thought, should I not? She stayed on the train. She did the full line and she came back to Tower Hill. She entered the Tower of London. She went to see the crown jewels. There was a group of kids there, school kids. So the beefeaters, the guards, they believed that she was the teacher. And just in front of the crown jewels, she got out the crowbar and she threw the crowbar across the room right above the kid's head. So again, she's lucky not to have injured anyone, and she smashed the crown jewels window. So of course, she ended up in the newspaper and everything, exactly what she had hoped for. So some of them were really, really successful at causing terror. Anyway, we are now in front of Caxton House. This is where the suffragettes used to gather to do their little political meetings. The building was originally built as the town hall. That used to be the Westminster town hall originally. The lady that built that, she laid the foundation stone. It's Angela Burdett Coutts. We've spoken about her last Saturday on my tour. It's been a place to many political meetings. In the 60s, they had some people campaigning for gay rights as well. So it is. That's why the memorial has been placed here. Ooh. I thought I was going to be splashed, but no, that's okay. So yeah, the little garden, so completely unrelated to the suffragettes. But while we're here, I need to tell you about a couple of people that are buried here. Today it's a garden, but it used to be the graveyard of St. Margaret Church, the one that's right next to Westminster Abbey. We have Colonel Thomas Blood is the guy that stole the crown jewels in 1671, I think it was. The guy hired an actress to play his wife. They went to see the crown jewels, and his wife faked a stomach ache. And the guard was wanted to help, so he went to get some liquor for her stomach. And then Thomas came back to the tower a few days later with a lot of gloves, white gloves, to give to the guard to say thank you for helping his poor wife when she had her stomach issue. And then he made friends with the guard, and he decided to ask if the guard's daughter would marry his nephew. Then he came back with his so-called nephew. It was a fake nephew, of course. And then he attacked. He stole the crown jewels. He ran away with the jewels. And eventually he was arrested. Yes, exactly. That's the one, Stefan. He was arrested and he refused to answer any questions. He wanted to speak only to the king. So the King Charles II came to interrogate him. And would you believe, instead of being executed, not only was he spared, but Charles II gave him a pension and a house. We don't know why Thomas Blood, was the king just impressed, or did Thomas Blood kind of blackmail him for any reason? We don't know. So he's buried here somewhere. We also have Ignacio Sancho. We've spoken about here a few weeks ago when I did a tour about the Frost Fair. It's a man that went from slavery to high society. He escaped slavery and he ended up being buried here. There's also a lady, that's an interesting one, Margaret Batten. She was known to have lived 136 years old at the time of James I. We don't know whether that's true, but if that's true, she would have been the oldest woman in the world, because the oldest woman in the world is meant to be Jeanne Calment, a French lady. Although she's a fraud, Jeanne Calment. Hold on, I'm struggling with the umbrella here. It's a bit windy. Jeanne Calment, she probably was never 121 years old. We now believe her daughter took her mom's identity after the war. Anyway, let's get back to our suffragettes. So we had some interesting suffragettes. Let me try to hold on. I'm going to swap my hands. There we go. Right. One of them, we mentioned her very quickly. Well, actually, talking about the crown jewels, you might have heard of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The Koh-i-Noor diamond was stolen, basically from, officially it was gifted to Queen Victoria, but with the gifts gifted to the British empires, so, some of them were kind of stolen. And it was taken from a boy Apologies, the traffic is a bit noisy here. His name is Maharaja Dulip Singh. So he was a Maharaja in India, and his kingdom was stolen by the British, and he was then moved to. He was kind of forced to move in here, and he was taken as uh, almost like a godchild of Queen Victoria. He grew up here in England with. He was a good friend of Edward VII, and he had a few daughters. The last one, Sophia Dulip Singh, she was an amazing suffragette. She decided to join the suffragette movement, but she was very famous because she was the goddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was all over the magazines. It was the beginning of ladies' magazines and stuff. She was a fashion icon. She was a socialite. She used to go to all the parties. And of course, she was royalty. She was an Indian princess. And she lived in Hampton Court in an apartment that was gifted to her by Queen Victoria. We call them grace on favor apartment. It is basically when the Queen gives you an apartment and you don't have to pay anything. And Sophia decided to join the suffragette. So that helped the movement getting a very famous face. And actually, even at Black Friday, she was there fighting the police officers. But everyone knew her. So even the officers, they were like, oh no, we cannot arrest Sophia. She's royalty. And Sophia, she joined the tax resistance league. So some of those ladies were quite wealthy, but they decided that if they couldn't have a say in government, like if they cannot have any representation, why should they pay taxes then? So they stopped paying their taxes. And Sophia, living in Hampton Court, she ended up having the bailiffs. They came to seize her property. So they took a ring with a massive diamond. So that's funny because it's what happened to her dad as well. His massive diamond was stolen. And then they did an auction. And of course, at the auction, the suffragettes were rioting. And actually, one of her friends bought the ring and they give it back to her. So yeah, amazing lady. And she was seen in Hampton Court selling the suffragette newspaper. Let me show you a photo in the chat. She had been dragged into the suffragette movement mainly because of what happened to her bigger sisters. One of them, she moved to Chicago to train as a surgeon. And as she was about to complete her training, they've decided that actually no, women cannot do surgery. And the other sister, she's amazing as well, Catherine, she fell in love with a woman. And she moved to Germany. She lived as a lesbian in the Nazi-growing Germany. And she was also a suffragette. She came back when her girlfriend died. Let me show you her sister, Catherine. There's a beautiful portrait. It's a modern portrait, but there she is. I think that means vote for women in German up there. So yeah, a family of interesting ladies. And Sophia, she ended up living in relative poverty here. They never took away her flat that was gifted by Queen Victoria, but then she didn't really have any income or anything. And so yeah, very interesting lady. And there's another suffragette that I have to mention. It is Emily Davidson. Wilding Davidson, to be precise. Emily was, even the suffragettes kind of considered her as a loose cannon. She used to work as an employee for the WSPU, but she had been fired because they believed she was a little bit too much. She was a very determined suffragette. She had been jailed and she was force-fed 49 times, and she was one of the bombers and all that. And what she had done that was really smart. In 1911, She hid in the House of Commons in Parliament in a broom cabinet, and she slept in there. And that was the night of the census, the 1911 census. So when they asked where she slept that night, in the House of Commons, she's officially registered on the 1911 census as living in the House of Commons. So that's quite exciting. This is Westminster Abbey, by the way. It was also bombed. So when the suffragettes started bombing, they bombed a lot of churches. They tried to bomb St. Paul's Cathedral as well. Actually, the lady that tried to hit the bomb in St. Paul's Cathedral, she looked so innocent that one of the police officers offered to help her carry the bomb. Well, obviously they didn't know it was a bomb, but they helped carrying it. Anyway, so yeah, the Abbey was also bombed a little bit. And Emily Wilding Davidson, you might have heard of her. In 1913, she went to the Epsom Derby, and she waited for the King's horse, and she jumped on the track. She was hit by the horse, and the jockey was ended up on the floor, and she lost her life. She was transferred into hospital, and she died. She died as a martyr for the cause. The video was played all over the TV channels everywhere. You can still see the video online. It's very shocking. Some argue now that maybe she did not want to die, that she probably was just trying to cause sensation, and that she might just have wanted to attach a suffragette banner on the King's horse. And did that help the cause? It's actually hard to tell, because some might also say, well, look, we shouldn't give ladies the vote if they are that stupid or unstable or unpredictable. So Christabel still used it. Christabel, she was hiding in Paris at the time, Christabel Pankhurst. She was still responsible for the Suffragette magazine, but she was hiding there. So the suffragettes have used it, and Emily Davidson's funeral was a massive event with 50,000 ladies and people supporting the cause on the streets. But did that really help? It is actually debatable. And of course, in 1914, we all know what happened. It is the First World War. So suddenly the suffragettes decided to stop, to pause their militant action for the time of the war. A lot of the young men went fighting anyway, so the ladies had to take over their jobs. So the ladies proved that they were capable of pretty much doing anything that the men were doing. And when the young men came back, those young men, a lot of them did not have the right to vote, because they were working classes that did not have property. So when they came back from the war, some of them injured, some of them would have been missing limbs, and some of them have lost a lot of their friends. It felt like they had to give them the vote. How could they ignore their right to vote when those men had been fighting for their nation? Some had lost their friends, their life, their legs. So they had to give all the men the right to vote. So then they had to give ladies, or to do something for ladies as well, because it was not going to go down well. So they've decided just after the war, in 1918, to give ladies over 30 the right to vote. Now, why did they give all men over 21 the right to vote, and only ladies over 30? It is because a lot of young men had died. So if we gave all ladies over 21 the right to vote, then ladies would have been the majority. They were not ready for that. So they decided to give only ladies over 30. This way that would represent, yes, Marilyn, at that point, they also had to have property, yeah. So that'll be 43% of the population. And eventually, 10 years later, 16 days after Emmeline Pankhurst died, they've decided to give every woman over 21 the right to vote in 1928. So it's still earlier than most countries in Europe, but New Zealand and Australia had already given the ladies the right to vote much earlier. Ooh. All right. Sorry, the wind is... can't even go. So that's the beautiful Tower Elizabeth. And let's go back in time. I told you it was not going to be very much chronological. I wanted to introduce you to a new statue. We had only men in Parliament Square until 2018. We had a campaigner that she's an amazing lady. She's the one that managed to get Jane Austen on the £10 note because we only had men on the notes. She was going for a run in Parliament Square, and she was shocked to see that there were only men. There were absolutely no ladies as a statue. So she started a campaign to have a lady here. At first, they even considered moving Emmeline Pankhurst. But the point was to have more ladies, not to move the ones we already have. So eventually they commissioned the beautiful statue of Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Garrett, you might know that name because of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. She was the first lady to qualify as a doctor. Well, the first lady to qualify as a doctor as a lady. Let's not say too much about that because I don't want to do a spoiler on my tour tomorrow. But let's say we had women qualifying before that. Yes, absolutely, David. We did have a woman on the note, the Queen. Yes, absolutely. We don't have many statues of women. In London, we have 2.7, but we calculate that from named female non-royal. Because, of course, we have many statues of kings and queens. We also have statues of allegorical figures and, you know, but in terms of named ladies that are non-royal, we really don't have many. So Millicent Garrett Fawcett, she was not a suffragette. She was a suffragist. And she was really, really good at answering the argument of the people that were against women's suffrage. The main argument was ladies are not, they're stupider than men. So the logical answer for us would say, no, that's not true. Well, that's the wrong answer. If you say that's not true, you can have Lauren, let me show you the name. It's Millicent Garrett Fawcett. So if I tell you ladies are not smarter as men, you know, if you say that's not true, it's the wrong answer because someone can show you a statistic, a study. Actually, Millicent, she doesn't know whether ladies are actually stupider than men or not. We did not invent the IQ yet. So she said, yeah, maybe. So what? If it was proven that the northerner are actually stupider than the southerner, some people still believe that today, you know, would you take away their right to vote in the north? No. So, you know, so that she was really good at answering. And all the little people on the side, it's hard to see when they're wet, but those are all, I think it's 52 women and 4 men that helped getting the vote. Now, let me see if I can grab my flower. I did bring her a flower, but let's see, because, oh yes, it's still here, because yesterday I tried to give a flower to Noor Inayat Khan, and then I had lost my petal. There we go. Let's give her a flower. I think she got quite a few already today. But it is to be expected. Sorry, I'm not very good at this. My fingers are frozen. There we go. So yeah, Millicent, she was in London in Parliament in the 1860s when one guy tried to change the name, the term men on the bill to a person. Obviously, that did not go through, and you know, after years and years, and it was a life fight, really. Eventually, she was still there to see the bill pass in Parliament to give women the vote. So she's an amazing lady, but suffragist. Whether the suffragettes were the one that got us the vote, or was it the war, or was it the suffragist, or was it a combination of all those different factors? We don't really know. Historians are still debating it today, but I think we can give a big thank you to all of them anyway, whether they used violence or not. And yeah, exactly, Stefan. It's probably a combination. Anyway, that's going to be the end of the tour. So if you have any questions, let me know. But you know what? Let's go and say hello to Churchill. Churchill, as amazing as he is, no one is black or white. He was also strongly against the ladies' suffrage. It's not rare for a man of his time, but apparently his wife Clementine, she was trying to help the cause, but Churchill himself, no, he did not think ladies were good enough for that. Sorry, I'm struggling with the wind, but we'll go and see Churchill anyway. We'll make it. Right. And there he is. Churchill was attacked himself a few times by the suffragettes. Once I think it was in Tamshed on the train station, one suffragette was nearly pushing him on the track. She just wanted to show that she could have done it. So there he is. Still a great man, yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. As I said, for most of men of his time, they did not even imagine giving the vote to ladies. Anyway, that's going to be the end of the tour. Let me show you my face again, and let me know if you have any questions for me. If not, thank you very much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry about the rain. I know it's always nicer when it's not raining, but hey ho. Thank you, Tish. So thanks everyone for